Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Back again to go over my tier lists, our tier list in review. Time for me to either double down or kind of change some of my opinions, some of my answers before the expansion drops as to where I see a lot of these specs standing, what kind of content are they going to really shine in, and maybe influence a bit of people's decision making as well. We'll see. So, starting it off, I wanted to kind of have this as, you know, what has changed in that past 2 months, because a lot of people have been asking me if the tier list still kind of held up water, what I thought had kind of changed, and my original intention for those videos was to kind of lay out where I think the spec is going, not necessarily where it was at the time, and some of the reasons that would kind of influence that. So like Mistweaver, for example, had a really rough beta cycle early on because like a ton of her abilities just didn't work properly, right? They were kind of propped up by bug interactions, for example. But one of the things I said in the prior video was like, oh, once those things get fixed, it'll still be pretty solid. So I want to start off from a raid perspective and fire it up. Here's the tier list that I had for raiding, with Resto Shaman, Disc Priest at the top, Mistweaver, Holy Pally in the middle, and Holy Priest and Resto Druid in that B tier. And I said it before, and I'll say it again, the idea behind this tier list was to show that there wasn't that big of a gap in between the value of these different healers, especially for the average raid group, all right? Mainly to highlight what the best guilds in the world are really going to be running, what might be helpful, for example, to bring here and there if you have somebody who's really willing and flexible to switch. And I gotta say, a lot of my analysis for this really holds true, and in my opinion, and I really think that this tier list is probably going to be the game plan for what follows. So even though you can bring 4 healers to your raid, your priority in that S tier is because there's a very high likelihood you'll actually bring 2 shamans or 2 discipline priests on certain encounters, right? Not on every single fight. I don't think the composition is going to be 2 discs, 2 holy, 2 discs, 2 resto for every single encounter. Don't get me wrong, but I think that they are the 2 specs that likely will be stacked in world first progression, right? Resto Shaman, for example, has crazy utility. It's got good enough mobility for the areas where you need to really like stretch and really need to heal on the move, for example. Spiralink Totem is fantastic. There's plenty of uses for it, and the more that people are stacked up, the more use Ankh Totem really starts getting, especially when there's certain mechanics you want to be able to cheese, get your way out of, or just generally save somebody who got too many bleeds in this bleed-rich raid. So Resto Shaman still holding on to that top spot. Its passive damage is pretty good, but from what I've seen so far, testing pretty much every single encounter on Heroic, on Mythic and everything, there's going to be some damage checks, absolutely. And I think it'll be able to keep up, and I don't think that healer damage is like the end-all, be-all, right? Discipline, of course, has crazy excellent damage, but it also has some fantastic ramp-up windows. At the time of the tier list that I made before, Spirit Shell was very much a meme and didn't really have a lot of support for it, so nobody was really playing it at all in raid testing. Since then, Discipline has received some mighty buffs to Spirit Shell, followed by some subsequent nerfs. So where Spirit Shell stands so far is that it might just be a very competitive option on a number of encounters, depending on what is needed. The fact that Spirit Shell's maximum absorb per person is based off 60% of the casting priest's health, and that health can be increased temporarily by Ancestral Vigor from Resto Shamans, meaning your shields can be even larger on the entirety of the raid, is pretty busted. You can also have 2 Discipline Priests and have 2 stacking Spirit Shells. They're just 2 independent buffs, so they can have 2 independent health pool caps to be able to help you out. So the potential for this is pretty mind-boggling, pretty obscene, really. It may not be something that gets used on every single fight, but just generally speaking, absorbs in high-end raiding have been abused and have had some tremendous history. It's also screwed over a lot of other healers. So Discipline definitely still staying at that top spot as well. Mistweaver and Holy Pally have, had a lot of concerns and had a lot of issues going on with them. I believe that Mistweaver still stays in that A category because now that a lot of the bugs have gotten fixed, Mistweaver's throughput's still very strong. It fits very well with a lot of the damage profiles that Castle Nathria throws at it. And it actually has some big healing cooldowns, which it lacked before, now that the Yu'lon's Now that the essence of Yu'lon, the celestial Yu'lon, is working properly, enveloping breath is working properly, you actually have some large cooldowns at your disposal to be able to utilize whenever really you need to. When it comes to Paladin's very consistently had some low throughput through most of the raid testing that we've been seeing, and that's been a pretty big concern. But the past month, they've been very slowly but steadily buffing Holy Paladins to the point that they are monster single target healers, and they've mostly also just figured out how they want to be playing the spec, how they want to be optimizing the spec and everything like that. And that coupled with class buffs, with legendary buffs, especially something like Shock Barrier. Shock Barriers are legendary that whenever you Holy Shock, you create an Absorb. See where I'm getting with this? What makes classes good? Absorbs. And instead of only hitting 3 targets or only being up on 3 targets, it's now 5 targets. So even more absorbs that you're able to spread, hyper efficient healing, and they've really pushed Paladin into a position where I think it's going to get brought a lot more frequently, and it becomes a much more solid A tier than it was before. Previously, I was a little shaky on having it at that point, and it was more of the expectation that in the 11th hour, Paladin would get buffed. And sure enough, that's where we are right now at the time of the video, a week before release, and many buffs for Paladin coming in to make sure it's at that point. The reasoning that for not having it at S tier is I just don't think that you're going to bring 2 Paladins to many encounters, although I do think it's going to be totally fine in that 3rd or 4th healer slot. Earning a spot, being good for a variety of encounters, even though it's going to be pretty slow, kind of clunky to play early on, that's just kind of Paladin's MO. When it comes to the B tier, and I really want to stress this, and unfortunately a lot of people are just going to screenshot this and be like, this is what Jack said, you know, and then that's it. But to tell those people, please kind of listen, because the B tier doesn't mean it's going to be bad. The B tier doesn't mean that you shouldn't invite any of these people to the group or anything like that. Specifically for the high-end raid community, I don't think you're going to see a ton of Holy Priest or a ton of Resto Druid. Resto Druid, for example, they've kind of continuously chipped away at a lot of its niche, a lot of its benefits and everything. So even when you get some of these high mobility encounters, you know, you still have good movement out of like Resto Shaman with Spirit Walker's Grace on the move. Mistweaver is mobile enough to be able to get the job done, for example. Disc is able to preempt shields now at a massive scale so that they could just toss up a bunch of shields before they have to move, for example. So a lot of times our Druid's niches have just been kind of taken away from it. You know, there's no more moving trank. And like I said, there's a lot of other fill-ins to deal with those high mobility areas. The damage that gets dealt from, I believe, Convoke for the Nightfey Covenant is really good. Like healer damage wise, our Druid does quite well. But again, damage isn't the end all be all. And when you're looking for best synergy towards the damage, when you're looking at the utility you can bring to the group, for high-end raiding guilds, I don't think we're going to really see a lot of Resto Druid, excuse me. And kind of same goes for Holy Priest. Holy Priest is a totally fine healer, does great throughput, has a wealth of cooldowns. Their Covenant and Necrolord can synergize with just buffing the raid cooldowns as well through their soulbinds. So you have a lot of good upsides there. And like I said, for the average Mythic guild, average raiding guild, Holy Priest will be totally 100% fine. I, again, just don't see many high-end guilds bring the Holy Priest to the table because there's just that bit of utility sort of missing from both those healers of the B tier. You know, when you're looking at everybody else, you know, there's crazy absorbs, crazy utility, and you know, very, very strong single target that'll be able to propel them higher and help them support the tanks or help some of that intermediate healing when there's tons of bleeds going out, things like that. That's really just kind of what's missing for these bottom 2 healers. Otherwise, I don't think that there is anything wrong with them whatsoever. So, now that we've covered some of the raid stuff, I wanted to talk about Mythic Plus as well, because while I did agree with my previous findings for rating and some of my rankings that I had there previously, I wanted to actually have some edits to my Mythic Plus setup. So, our previous Mythic Plus setup had Resto Druid at the top, followed by Mistweaver and Disc, followed by Paladin, and then followed by Resto Shaman and Holy Priest. And I gotta say pretty confidently, this ain't it. After cycling through all the healers and playing a lot more M+, and also just keeping up to date with a lot of the changes that were going on for the different healers, I definitely would like to make quite a few changes on this one. Paladin definitely didn't feel as good as I wanted it to early on, and it will generally just not really have any sort of movement. Probably the biggest movement that you'll see from this is really for Resto Shaman and for Holy Priest as we take a look at the updated tier list I have for it. Resto Shaman actually feels very, very good in Mythic Plus, and Holy Priest felt a lot better now that they made a couple different changes to how the spec works. So, for example, we'll start with Holy Priest here. Holy Priest, they started making Renew actually valuable to cast in 5-mans through the Renewed Faith talent. Apotheosis will reset the cooldown of your Holy Words, and you can really just cycle through them at a really rapid rate. And one of the big changes, though, is that Shadowlands dungeons are really heavily group-based, and this is going to hold true for Shaman as well when I talk about it, that there's a lot more need to actually pump a lot of AoE healing into the group. It's not just spam a bunch of flash heal into the tank as much as you possibly can, and huzzah, like 70% of your healing is a tank, and then everybody else kind of takes a little damage sometimes, right? Shadowlands dungeons actually deal damage to the group. Big part of that is prideful, but another is that the bosses often will have like ticking damage going on with them, or some ads come out and they die and they explode for a bunch of damage, something along those lines, right? So group-wide healing becomes more relevant, so Prayer of Mending, Circle of Healing, your AoE spells are really a lot more relevant. On the Resto Shaman side, that very much holds true, where you're able to get pretty constant value out of like Cloudburst. Healing Rain can be kind of a pain to utilize when everybody and their mother wants to play ranged DPS in dungeons right now, but if you can corral people to stack up for Prideful, it's usually not too terribly big of a deal. I played with both the Necrolord Covenant and the Venthyr Covenant for 5-mans, so the Necrolord kind of shores up some of that spread healing that you have to do when people are not wanting to stack, so you can use your Primordial Wave, your buffed Healing Wave, and kind of top everybody off with it. Leaning on like a big variety of small cooldowns has been really, really valuable for Resto Shaman, and you're also just like a single target monster. Resto Shaman is a great single target monster that is able to just pummel bosses with ease. Like, I barely have to spend a lot of activity time dealing damage. You toss Flame Shock up, and you're constantly getting Lava Burst procs in between when you're supposed to be healing. So that, Echo the Elements, a lot of good benefits to Resto Shaman. And it's just general overall pretty good utility. Holy Priest I still keep a little below Shaman though, because Holy Priest and Holy Pally for that matter do still have some weak spots when it comes to Prideful. They don't quite have enough oomph to help them through some of the largest levels, and you're kind of leaning on people to critically use some of their own defensives and immunities and things like that to help get you through those last higher levels of Prideful. But when it comes to 15s and everything like that, just doing your casual 15s at a regular gear level, you shouldn't have no problem with any of the healers. It's just when you go higher and higher in these dungeons, who's going to start kind of struggling first? And I found that Paladin, both Holies, Holy Priest and Holy Pally, started to have to struggle a bit more in those areas. With Glimmer and Shock Barrier and the Kyrian Covenant for Holy Pally, it's really nice having that kind of comeback mechanic. But you very much have to like run these dungeons a couple times, get very used to when you can use your cooldowns for damage, when you can't, and because you don't really have quick bounce back, you really have to work on your preparation as you're getting yourself set and getting yourself comfortable with these dungeons. So I'd say Paladin and Holy Priest are going to kind of struggle early on, and I think that Healer Balance, though, just looking at previous seasons and looking at previous expansions and everything like that, I think the gap between the healers in Shadowlands is like very close together compared to BFA Season 4, where you just had these massive disparities in terms of the performance of the different healers. The fact that there's more AoE damage going on the entire group is great. The fact that the healers are kind of shored up in some of their weak spots through their Covenant abilities is also great. You know, Necrolords on Holy Nova for Holy Priests, the Holy Pally Divine Toll, things like that you can actually just use to kind of bounce back. Like I talked about previously with Shaman, you're going to have access to your Primordial Wave. You know, our Druid, again, is just continuing to double down on what it's great at. You know, it already does great damage, it already had great passive damage, it already dealt very well with group-wide healing, and it pretty much continues to do so. There were some concerns about, like, Mistweaver damage, and I think that it's really not as big of a deal. Being able to bring the physical vulnerability is pretty nice, and having hunters be a very big part of the M+ scene, at least on beta right now, is always really nice. So you're at least having one of the ranged DPS benefiting from that physical vulnerability. Rising Sun Kick had recently been buffed, so it actually hits like a truck now, and you're kind of bouncing around and playing musical chairs with your covenants. But you have a couple covenants that'll be able to work out really well in 5-mans. Venthir got nerfed pretty substantially, but it's still a very good cooldown to just lock down Prideful whenever Prideful's coming out. Necrolord has been buffed quite a bit recently, so you can have that flexibility of like damage or healing for Monk as well. So you still have a lot of good options there. Even though you have to be in melee, you have to kind of be in the thick of things quite a bit in order to clock in some good damage. Discipline has been kind of all over the place with some of its buffs and nerfs and changes and everything going on for it, but it's remained pretty strong for 5-mans, in large part thanks to the Kyrian Covenant. Overall, it's done a very good job of making sure that it was able to shore up its biggest weak spots. And that's probably one of the biggest reasons, in addition to the dungeons changing, and in terms of the dungeon like damage profiles changing, the Covenant abilities really start making your weak spots even better. So when you're having a class that's competitively focused on just 5-mans, you're able to pick a Covenant based off of what your greatest weakness is, and that makes your life a hell of a lot easier. So for Disc, you know, dealing with High Prideful, dealing with Tyrannical, things like that are always going to be a challenge, and they're frequently a challenge for all the healers in some respects. But that's where the Kyrian Covenant can just be activated once every 3 minutes, and you're able to have very good damage that converts into atonement healing, so you can continue DPSing. You don't need everybody stacked right away, and then in the higher levels of Prideful, you can drop barrier and make sure everybody gets stacked inside of it before the last couple ticks and everything like that. So you have recourse for most all the healers, but it sort of just varies in terms of who deals with it a little bit better, right? Holy Priest, Holy Pally, they got their Covenant abilities to help and have a bit of bounce back, but they really can fall behind, and that can always be a critical issue. Resto Shaman's kind of like a game of making sure that you're constantly cycling Cloudbursts, at least from the way I was playing, which was hopefully correct. Constantly cycling your Cloudbursts to make sure that you always have like another burst of healing at your disposal, you know, leaning on Primordial Wave when there's more split damage, so you don't have to have everybody stacked up all the time to be able to do some good healing into them. Disc, like I said, you've got your Kyrian Covenant, you got a very large cooldown at your disposal whenever you need to, and you're always able to share your power infusion, just like Holy Priest is, to buff other people. Mistweaver, again, your monstrous single target healing, great resources at your disposal. You gotta get into melee to make sure you're getting everybody debuffed, but as long as you have a couple people benefiting from that physical vulnerability, while you will not have the highest damage of healers, that physical vulnerability definitely makes up for it in a pretty big way. And of course, Resto Druid, our king of 5-mans, at the very tip top, no surprise on that one, is going to be absolutely crushing you. So we'll see what happens. Those are going to be my final thoughts for the tier lists before Shadowlands drops. Let me know what you guys think. If you have any other sort of questions, feel free to leave them down in the comments below. Be sure to thumbs up the video, sub to the channel, all that other stuff, as we're going to be having tons and tons of content coming right around the corner. Just finished working on a big chunk of my Disc and Holy guides for Wowhead, and we'll be having Disc and Holy 9.0 guides coming up on the channel very, very soon. So thanks so much for watching, guys. Be sure to check out the Twitch channel, all those other places linked in the description below, and I'll catch y'all next time.